The host looked at him the way people looked at things that had arrived in the wrong category. It was not a hostile look. It was not the look of someone who wanted to cause harm or who was aware of causing harm. It was the look of a person who had made a rapid, automatic assessment and had arrived at a conclusion they considered obvious, and who was now operating from that conclusion with the smooth efficiency of someone who did not expect the conclusion to be challenged. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 43 years old, wearing a dark navy jacket over a plain white shirt, dark trousers, and leather shoes that were well-made and entirely unremarkable. He was holding the hand of his 8-year-old daughter, Zola, who was wearing a yellow dress with small white buttons down the front that she had chosen herself that morning with the decisive certainty of a child who knew exactly what she wanted to wear and required no second opinion. Zola was holding a small notebook. She carried it everywhere. It had a burgundy cover, and she used it to write down things she considered worth keeping, which was most things, because she had decided at age 6 that the world contained more things worth keeping than most people were paying attention to, and she had taken it upon herself to pay attention. The restaurant was called Ember. It occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian building in the city's financial quarter, and it was the kind of place that did not need a sign above the door because the people who needed to know about it already knew, and the people who did not know were not the people it was designed for. The entrance was marked only by a small brass fixture beside the door, the kind of understatement that communicated more than a neon sign would have. Inside, visible through the glass panels beside the door, the room was warm and considered. Dark wood and low lighting, and white tablecloths and the specific arrangement of tables that happened when someone had thought carefully about how people moved through a dining room and what they needed from the space around them. A bar ran along the left wall with the clean precision of something that had been designed rather than assembled. Zola was looking at the bar. She was looking at it with the focused attention of a child who had a strong visual sensibility and encountered things that satisfied it with a specific quality of stillness that Marcus had learned to recognize and had never once interrupted. The host cleared his throat. He was in his mid-30s, dressed in the house uniform of dark jacket and white shirt, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that his presentation was part of the restaurant's presentation. His name tag read Oliver. "Good evening," Oliver said in the tone of someone who was already managing the situation before the situation had fully presented itself. "Do you have a reservation with us this evening?" Marcus said, "We don't have a reservation. We were hoping to find a table if there's availability." Oliver looked at his screen with the practiced efficiency of someone who was going to find a specific answer rather than a general one. He looked at it for the correct amount of time and then looked up. "I'm afraid we're fully committed this evening," he said. "Ember is a members' establishment, and our tables are reserved exclusively for registered members and their confirmed guests." He paused. "We do have a members' application available if you'd like to consider joining." He said this last part with the smooth finality of someone who expected the offer of an application to close a conversation by redirecting it into the future, away from the present difficulty. Marcus looked at him. He said, "I am a member." Something in Oliver's expression adjusted. Not dramatically, not with any visible discomfort. Just a small recalibration, the expression of someone whose internal model of the conversation had been handed an unexpected variable. He said, "Could I have your membership number?" Marcus said, "I don't have my card with me. My name is Marcus Webb," Oliver typed. He looked at his screen. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Marcus with an expression that had not changed from the recalibrated position. He said, "I'm seeing a Marcus Webb in our system, but the membership category listed is a corporate account. Those memberships are typically used for business entertaining rather than personal dining, and the account shows no reservation for this evening." He paused. "Our policy for corporate accounts requires advance booking of at least 48 hours. Marcus said, "I'm aware of the policy." "I wrote it," Oliver blinked. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was there. He said, "I'm sorry," Marcus said, "the corporate account policy. I wrote it. About 4 years ago." He kept his voice even, the way he kept his voice even in most situations that wanted to pull it somewhere else. "Could you check the membership hierarchy on that account?" Oliver looked at his screen with the expression of someone who was now genuinely trying to find what was there rather than confirming what he had expected to find. He looked at it for longer than before. His expression moved through several stages of reading. Then he stopped. He looked at Marcus. He looked at him the way a person looked at something they had just understood differently than they had understood it 30 seconds ago. He said, "One moment, please." His voice had changed register. The smooth finality had gone out of it and been replaced by something more careful. He picked up the phone beside the terminal and made a brief call. He said 4 words and then listened for approximately 20 seconds and put the phone down. He said, "Mr. Webb, I'm sorry. Please come in." He stepped back from the host stand with the movement of a man who understood that the geometry of the situation had fundamentally changed and was adjusting to it correctly. Marcus said, "Thank you, Oliver." They walked in. Zola had been standing beside her father throughout this exchange with her notebook under her arm and the expression of a child who had been listening carefully and was still processing. She looked at the bar as they passed it, the one she had been looking at through the glass. And then she looked at the room. And she did what she always did in rooms that were worth looking at, which was stop and take it in properly before moving further into it, she said, quietly, just for herself but loud enough for Marcus to hear. Someone thought about this. Marcus looked at the room. He said they did. She said, "How do you know?" He said, "The tables. Look at the distance between them." She looked. She said, "They're not too close." He said, "They're exactly far enough apart that you feel private without feeling isolated." Most restaurants get that wrong in one direction or the other. Zola wrote something in her notebook. Marcus watched her do it and felt the specific warmth that came with watching his daughter document a thing she had decided was worth keeping. A woman appeared from the interior of the restaurant. She was in her mid-40s, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had been called away from something and had understood immediately why. She was the general manager of Ember, her name was Renata, and she had been with the Webb Dining Group for 6 years, through 2 restaurant openings and 1 renovation, and the specific accumulated work of running an establishment that had maintained its reputation for that entire period without compromising the things that had built the reputation. She had met Marcus Webb 4 times. She had met him in conference rooms and in kitchens, and once in this very dining room at a table in the back left corner during an unannounced visit 18 months ago, when he had eaten a full meal and spoken with the kitchen team for 20 minutes and left without the dining room staff knowing who he had been. She knew his face. She had recognized it the moment Oliver's call described the situation at the host stand. "Mr. Webb," Renata said. She said it with the directness of someone who was not going to dress the moment in anything it didn't need. "I'm sorry for the delay at the entrance." Marcus said, "Renata." She said, "We have a table available. Your preferred position is open." She looked at Zola. "Good evening." Zola looked at her with the frank assessment she applied to new adults. She said, "Good evening." She said it with the formal precision she used when she had not yet decided what she thought of someone. Renata led them through the dining room. Marcus walked through it with the attention he always brought to his restaurants when he was in them, not aggressively, not as an audit, just the natural attention of someone who had built something and cared about whether it was still being what he had built it to be. He looked at the tables and the people at them, and the servers moving between them, and the quality of the light and the sound level of the room, which was what he always listened to first, because a room's sound level told him more about the quality of service than almost anything else. A room that was too loud meant the tables were too close, or the atmosphere had been misjudged. A room that was too quiet meant something in the energy was off. This room was exactly right. He had built it to be exactly right. He had spent 4 months on the acoustic treatment alone. They reached the table in the back left corner, the one Marcus had always used for this restaurant when he was here as himself, rather than as a visitor. The one Renata had referenced as his preferred position because it had a view of the full dining room and sat slightly apart from the nearest tables and had the specific quality of a space that allowed you to be inside the room without being entirely subject to it. Zola sat across from him and looked at the room from this position with her notebook open on the table. She said, "You can see everything from here." Marcus said, "That's why I like it." She said, "But no one can see you looking." He said, "Not easily." She wrote something in the notebook. She wrote with the focused deliberateness of a child who had decided that what she was writing mattered and gave it the handwriting it deserved. Renata brought menus and water and the small card of evening specials that the kitchen had updated that morning. Zola received the menu with both hands and opened it and began reading it with the seriousness of someone for whom ordering food was a considered activity. Marcus looked at the menu. He looked at it the way he always looked at the menu when he was in one of his restaurants, reading it simultaneously as a guest and as the person who had approved every item on it, which was a dual perspective that did not conflict but added texture to each read. He had been in the restaurant business for 16 years. He had started with a single 40-seat bistro in a neighborhood that was not yet the neighborhood it later became, which was a matter of luck as much as judgment, though he had had some judgment about it too. He had built the bistro into something that worked, and then he had built something else, and then something else after that. And now the Webb Dining Group comprised 7 establishments across the city, ranging from the 40-seat bistro, which was still there and still working, to Ember, which was the most recent and the most refined, and the one he had spent the most time on getting right. He had not built any of them with his name above the door. The bistro was called the Corner Table. The Italian place was called Via. The seafood restaurant was called Tide. Ember was Ember. None of them were called Webb because the point had never been the name. The point had always been the room and the food, and the distance between the tables, and the sound level and the specific quality of a meal that stayed with you not because of what it cost, but because of what it was. Zola looked up from the menu. She said, "What's the lamb?" Marcus said, "It's braised, slow-cooked with herbs from a farm about 40 miles from here. The chef has been doing a version of it for 3 years. It's one of the best things we serve." Zola looked at the menu again. She said, "Is that we as in you personally, or we as in this restaurant?" Marcus said, "Both." She looked at him. She said, "Do you own this restaurant?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And the others?" He said, "There are 7 in total." "Yes." Zola looked at this information from several angles, the way she looked at most things that required proper consideration. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why the man at the door was being strange?" Marcus said, "Partly. He also didn't have all the information." She said, "But even before the information, he was already strange." "Before you told him anything?" Marcus looked at his daughter. He said yes. He was already deciding something before he had finished looking. She said, "About how you looked?" He said, "Most likely." She was quiet again. She looked at the room and then back at her notebook and then at her father. She said, "But you built this room." He said, "Yes." She said, "So he was deciding things about you in a room you built." He said, "That's right." Zola looked at this from every angle available to her. Then she wrote something in the notebook, slowly and carefully, the way she wrote things that she considered important enough to get right. Marcus watched her write. He did not ask what she was writing. He had learned that what she wrote in the notebook was for her first and for sharing later if she decided it was worth sharing, and he respected the distinction. Renata came to the table. She sat down briefly, the way she sat when she had something to say that required the sitting position rather than the standing one. She said, "I want to understand exactly what happened tonight." Marcus said. Oliver followed the protocol correctly. He found the account in the system. He identified the account type. He applied the policy. The protocol didn't account for the account holder being present in person. Renata said, "That's a gap." Marcus said, "It is. But it's not the gap I want to talk about." She looked at him. He said, "The gap I want to talk about is the 8 seconds between when we walked in and when Oliver looked at his screen." He looked at Renata steadily. He had already made a decision in those 8 seconds. The screen confirmed it. But the decision was made before the screen. Renata held his gaze. She said, "I know." He said, "You watched it?" she said. I watched the entrance footage before I came out to you. Yes, Marcus said. What did you see? She said, I saw someone make a judgment before they had any information, and then use the information to support the judgment rather than to form one. He said, that's an honest account. She said, what do you want to do about it? Marcus thought about it. He said, I want Oliver to stay. He's been here 2 years and he's good at his work, and what happened tonight is a values gap, not a skills gap. Values gaps are addressable if the person is willing to address them. Renata said, and if he's not? Marcus said, that will tell us something too. He paused. I want you to have a direct conversation with him. Not a disciplinary one. A real conversation about what he saw and what he decided and what those two things had to do with each other. I want him to sit with that. Renata said, I'll do it tonight after service. Marcus said, good. She said, is there anything else? He said, I want to look at the greeting protocol, the physical placement, the first words, the order of questions. I want it reviewed to see if there are points where a judgment can substitute for a procedure. Those points are the vulnerability, Renata said. I'll have it ready for you by end of week. Marcus said, thank you, Renata. She stood. She said, the lamb tonight is exceptional. The kitchen has been running it at a slightly lower temperature for the last service, and it's made a difference. Marcus said, I'll remember that. She went back to the management of the room, which was the work she was good at and which she returned to with the focused ease of someone who had been interrupted briefly and was now resuming. Zola had been listening to the conversation with the attentiveness she brought to conversations worth following. She had appeared to be looking at her menu. She had been doing both. She said, when Renata had gone, you're not angry at him. Marcus said, at Oliver? She said, yes. He said, no. She said, why not? He thought about how to answer that honestly, and in a way that was true and also something she could use. He said, because being angry at Oliver would make tonight about Oliver. And tonight isn't about Oliver. She said, what's it about? He said, it's about whether the places I've built are what I built them to be. And the honest answer is that what happened tonight tells me there's a gap between what I want these places to be and what they sometimes are in practice. That's the thing that matters. Zola looked at her notebook. She said, not who made the gap. He said, no. What the gap is and how to close it. She wrote something, she said, without looking up. That's the same thing you do with my math homework. He said, what do you mean? She said, when I get something wrong, you don't get angry at me. You look at where the reasoning broke down. She looked up. That's the same thing. Marcus looked at his daughter. He said, yes, it's the same thing, she said. So you run restaurants the same way you help with homework. He said, I think that's probably true. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that pleased her and that she was trying to understand fully. Then she wrote something else in the notebook. The food arrived. A server named Daniel, who had been at Ember since the opening and who moved through the dining room with the fluid efficiency of someone who was extremely good at what he did and had the specific ease of someone who knew it, brought the first course with the quiet precision that Marcus had always considered the highest form of service. The kind where the food arrived and the experience was elevated and no one in the transaction needed to perform anything. Zola looked at her plate. She said, it's arranged nicely. Marcus said, Daniel has strong opinions about plating. Zola said, he should. It's the first thing you see. Marcus said, that's what he says. She looked at her plate for another moment, and then at Daniel's retreating back, and then at her father. She said, everyone in this room is good at their job. Marcus said, most of them. Yes. She said, how do you find people who are good at their job? He said, you look for people who care about the thing itself, not the job. The thing the job is in service of. She said, what's this job in service of? He said, making people feel that the time they spent here was worth more than the time would have been if they'd been somewhere else. Zola thought about this. She said, that's a big thing to be in service of. He said, it is. She said, do you think tonight was worth more than if we'd been somewhere else? Marcus looked at his daughter in her yellow dress with her burgundy notebook and her question, and the first course on the plate in front of her, and the room he had built around them that was doing exactly what it had been built to do. He said, yes, I think so, she said. Even with the thing at the door? He said, even with the thing at the door, maybe especially because of it. She looked at this from several angles. She said, because you learned something. He said, because we both learned something. She looked at her notebook. She looked at what she had written. She said, can I read you what I wrote? He said, please. She looked at the page. She said, someone made a judgment before they had information. The judgment was wrong. The information didn't change the judgment. The information was used to support it. The gap is between seeing and deciding. That's where the work has to happen. She looked up. Marcus held his daughter's gaze across the table in the restaurant he had built. In the room he had spent 4 months on the acoustics for. At the table, with the view of the full dining room and the specific distance from the nearest tables that communicated private without isolated, and he felt something that was not pride and not relief, but lived in the territory between them and a little beyond. He said, that's exactly right, Zola, she said. I know. She closed the notebook. She picked up her fork. She said, the lamb smells incredible. He said, it is. She said, you should be proud of what you built. He said, I'm working on it. She looked at him. She said, work faster. It's really good. He looked at his daughter and at the room, and at the particular quality of an evening that had not gone the way he expected and had become, because of that, something more useful than it would otherwise have been. He picked up his fork. He thought about the gap between seeing and deciding and about the protocol. Review that would be ready by end of week and about Oliver's conversation with Renata that would happen tonight after service and about all the daily work of closing the distance between what you built and what it actually was when people encountered it. He thought about Zola writing it down. The gap is between seeing and deciding. That's where the work has to happen. 12 years from now, she was going to be running something. And she was going to remember that she had written it in a restaurant her father owned on an evening when someone at the door had decided something before they had finished looking. And she was going to use it, and the thing she ran was going to be better because she had written it down in a burgundy notebook at 8 years old. He did not say this. He ate his lamb, which was everything Renata had said it was, and listened to his daughter tell him what she thought of her own dish, which she had strong opinions about, and looked at the room they were sitting in, and thought that whatever gap existed between what it was and what he had built it to be, the room was still worth sitting in. That was the beginning. The gap was the work. The work never stopped. He had known that for 16 years and had never once wished it were otherwise. Some things you built that stayed exactly what they were. Some things you built that drifted. Gradually, in small ways, away from what they had been. And the builder's job was to notice the drift and correct for it. Not once but continuously, for as long as the thing was yours and you believed it was worth keeping exactly what it was. Marcus Webb believed all 7 of his restaurants were worth that. He was going to keep doing the work, starting tomorrow morning, with a protocol review and a conversation about the gap between seeing and deciding in the daily, patient work of closing it. Tonight was for the lamb and for the 8-year-old across the table who had written down the most accurate diagnosis of the evening's problem in a burgundy notebook between the first course and the second. He was going to be all right. The restaurant was going to be all right. The gap was going to be smaller by the end of the week than it was tonight. That was enough. That had always been exactly enough. He ordered dessert. Zola ordered dessert too, the chocolate one, because she had read the description 3 times and each time arrived at the same conclusion, which was that the description made it sound like the kind of thing that rewarded the decision to order it. It did. She ate it with the focused pleasure of someone who had made a good call and was acknowledging the quality of the call through the quality of her attention to it. She said, midway through, did you always want to do this? Marcus said, build restaurants? She said, yes. He thought about it honestly. He said, not at first. At first I wanted to be a chef, but I realized early that what I was actually interested in was the room, not the kitchen. The place where people sat and talked and ate and felt something they didn't expect to feel when they walked in. She said, the room is more important than the kitchen? He said, they're both important, but the kitchen is invisible to the people eating. The room is what they experience directly. If the room is wrong, it doesn't matter how good the food is. She considered this. She said, "But if the food is wrong, it doesn't matter how good the room is." He said, "Also true." She said, "So they're equally important." He said, "Yes, but most people think about the food first." "I always think about the room first." She looked at the room. She said, "Because if the room is right, the food has the best possible conditions to be received the way it deserves." Marcus looked at his daughter. He said, "That is an excellent sentence." She said, "I'm going to write it down." She wrote it down. She wrote it in the notebook with the careful handwriting she used for things she considered important. And she looked at it when she had finished and appeared satisfied with how it had translated from thought to page. Marcus watched her.